Hey, what's up? This is Twisted Mind, and you're watching the First Look series, an overview of the changes made to your class going into the Mists of Pandaria. All Druids can still provide the Mark of the Wild. All Druids can apply the Weakened Armor debuff. Guardian Druids can apply the Tank debuff, Weakened Blows. Both Guardian and Feral Druids bring the raid-wide crit buff through Leader of the Pack. And the Moonkin bring the raid-wide Spell Haste aura through their Moonkin aura. Your Remove Corruption ability now has an 8-second cooldown, but it does remove all curses and all poisons with one dispel. Your Rebirth spell got a buff to move its health percentage up to 60% when it brings a target back to life. This means that it's not as mandatory to glyph Rebirth anymore, so feel free to choose other major glyphs. Primal Fury is available in all specs, so it's not as punishing to switch into different roles you're not spec'd for. Also, a few of the Druid's base abilities now shift you into an appropriate form when you press them. This further supports the ability to play roles that you're actually not specified to do or spec'd into, and the new hybrid interchangeable playstyle. Druids will notice that they now have a fourth spec that they have the option of speccing into called Guardian. This is to separate the Feral Cat spec from the Bear spec that used to be the old Feral. Now Guardian got a complete overhaul in this new expansion. You'll notice here that all of these abilities that I have on my bar don't cost any rage anymore. In fact, only Mangle is a rage generator, and they all have flat fixed cooldowns that cannot be modified by haste. You have the option of gaining more rage by popping one of these two cooldowns in Rage or Berserk to Mangle spam, and you have the option of dumping your rage that you generate with these three abilities. Essentially, your rotation is the exact same as it was in Cataclysm. You want to prioritize Mangle above everything else. It doesn't have a bleed debuff that leads on the target, so you can start off with any of the other debuffs. You want to keep your Sunders up with your Fairy Fire button, and you want to keep the Thrash Bleed up, and you want to try to keep 3 stacks of Lacerate. As I'm demonstrating here, you can play Whack-A-Mole with each of these 4 abilities and just keep them off cooldown, although if you want to get technical, you want to try to maximize your Lacerate damage up front over the other 2 abilities. However, you don't want to leave dead cooldowns. In any AoE situation, you want to prioritize the swipe above Lacerate, but otherwise, you can pretty much just mash Fairy Fire, Thrash, and Lacerate and try to proc as many Mangles as you can. Note that Mangle is the only one of these abilities that generates Rage, and Rage is directly tied to your active survivability, so the more Mangles you can proc, the better you'll be at staying alive. This new model of play is easy to pick up, but a little harder to master, and there is one additional button that you'll have over the last expansion's rotation. Regarding your Enrage or your Berserk cooldowns, you try to want to spread them out and don't line them up, otherwise you'll rage cap. Also, you don't want to use these during a Heroism because the Heroism will give you the extra generated rage through white hits. You don't have to worry about Pulverize anymore, it's not in the game, only have to worry about what you're doing and debuffing to the target you're attacking. Your new Rage Dump abilities and your Active Mitigation playstyle is where this spec gets interesting. Your Frenzied Regeneration can be used at any time now. It'll instantly drop all of your rage up to 60 and give you a heal, as demonstrated here. Your Mastery is now Armor, so your Savage Defense is your new bread and butter, which you get when you spec Guardian. It takes at least 60 rage in order to activate Savage Defense, and as I'm demonstrating here, when you click on it, you get a severe increase to your dodge rating. This buff will last for 6 seconds, however, here's the catch. You have a limited number of charges that you can spend on this Savage Defense buff, and the charges refresh at a rate of every 9 seconds. You can see the charges on my icon for Savage Defense in the lower right hand corner, and how many charges I have remaining. What this means is if you have the rage, you can theoretically keep your Savage Defense running up every 6 seconds and have close to that 100% uptime for at least 18 seconds. However, once your charges are depleted, you would have to wait for 9 seconds for them to recharge, so playing your Bear Druid effectively now means that you have to gauge when is a good time for you to let that 3 seconds drop off where you don't have any Savage Defense on yourself. Otherwise, you'll be spending more charges faster than you're gaining them. And all of this is theoretically possible provided you actually have the rage being generated to spend them that fast. At lower gear levels, 60 rage is quite a lot. Also note that these 3 abilities, all 3 rage dumps, are off the global cooldown, so you can weave them into your rotation seamlessly. Theoretically, if you have more rage than you can spend, you also want to be dumping it into your Maul ability, but so far on beta testing, nobody's reached those gear levels where they have enough rage to dump it on Maul, so it's being largely overlooked. For now. You have a few new option interrupts as a Guardian Druid. One, if you specialize Guardian, you get an ability called Bear Hug. Bear Hug's basically a 3-second stun, but you can't do anything while you're stunning that. And also you notice, to be in line with the other melee abilities, Skull Bash has been reduced to a 15-second cooldown. Bash and Feral Charge are still in the game as talents. Your Might of Ursoc and your Barkskin are both Druid baselines. Ursoc can actually be lengthened in its cooldown for more health, and Barkskin can be used liberally. When you spec Guardian, you get Survival Instincts. Survival Instincts can also be shortened in its cooldown, which will shorten its duration, and puts bears in line with the rest of the tank classes. There are other cooldowns in your new talent system. The Feral DPS rotation remains partially the same, but there are a few tweaks in this spec going into Mists of Pandaria. First off, you'll notice, since Mangle doesn't have that bleed debuff to apply to a target, it's now only a combo point generator if you can't get behind your target. Otherwise, Shred is your primary combo point builder, which you get when you spec into Feral. Pretty much, keep Rake up, and then only refresh as the duration if necessary. You'll notice that those abilities have had their damage number percentage reduced, and that's because of the changes to Savage Roar. Savage Roar now, instead of increasing white damage, does a flat boost to your physical attack damage. This means that Savage Roar is now the top priority for keeping up 100% uptime. Then comes Rip, which remains largely unchanged. And then Ferocious Bite, which will still refresh Rip in execute range. Maim is still only used for PvP, as well as Pounce when coming out of stealth. Your 2 cooldowns are the exact same as they were in Kata. Berserk is still a 3-minute cooldown, and you want to not cap energy when using it, so avoid it with Heroism. And then your Targus Fury is also a very frequent cooldown that you want to be using as close to every 30 seconds as possible. We are going into a new expansion, so the crit levels and haste levels are way down. That means that your combo points are going to come a little bit more slowly, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to maintain uptime, and it means that for the start of the expansion, Ferals are going to be harshly penalized every time they need to switch targets. If no one in your raid is providing the weakened armor debuff, then it's up to you to keep that uptime with your Fairy Fire, weave it into your rotation. Because the Savage Roar is now affecting all physical attacks, that means your secondary stat preference is still up in the air and up to your personal playstyle, just like it was in Cataclysm, and there's still debate whether it's even worth it to be expertise capped. For me personally, at the start, I'm going to rely on Mastery. Even though our bleeds will be harder to manage, I think if you can pool your energy, you'll still have a pretty close to a high 100% uptime. Another big change is how you handle AoE. Thrash has been added into the kitty rotation as it now costs energy. It does provide the weakened blows effect, however it's a loss of DPS to use it in your single target rotation, so you want to rely on your tanks to keep that up on targets. But otherwise, you want to make sure that the bleed effect is up, and then you want to resume your swipe spam like normal. There are a few new talents in the talent tree that could cause some interesting combos that will affect your rotation slightly, such as these 2. You also have access to some new burst talents, or some new burst cooldowns that you didn't have before, that you can line up situationally either with your other existing cooldowns or right before them. Always mind your passives, such as Ravage having that extra crit modifier when a target's above 80% health. Admittably, for PvP anyway, some of our survivability was lost with the division between Feral and Guardian specs, but it's not that all hope is lost. There's plenty of new combinations and new interesting ways to play your Feral with the invention of this new talent system. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of new options that we didn't have before with the switching into these other roles that we're not specialized into, such as kiting, or healing more effectively. At the end of the day, there's tons of new combos and new options to be explored, so now's the time to get creative with your Feral. Wait, what's this? Is this the Tree of Life? Nope. That's right, folks. Permanent tree form is back. This time it's in the shape of a minor glyph. It appears on your bar as an extra stance, which means if you do shift into the other stances, which is now highly encouraged in this expansion, when you shift back you'll be in your normal default form, and it does take a global cooldown to get back up again. Also, Resto Druids now finally have a tank cooldown in the shape of Iron Bark, which does stack with Bark Skin as I'm demonstrating here. Your massive throughput remains the same still with your wild growth, and also your tranquility drops to a 3-minute cooldown when you spec Resto. Mind that wild growth is still glyphable, but it increases its cooldown for that increased target. Also note that your efflorescence that you used to have to spec for is now baked into Swiftmend. And also note that your Swiftmend now can do the same amount of throughput regardless of whether it was a regrowth or a rejuvenation that it consumed. You also now have an on-demand burst AoE heal in the form of your mushrooms. As you notice here, the targeting reticule is a little bit changed up where you can spam the 3 mushrooms quicker, and they're already capped on the 1-second global cooldown. Also note that the bloom does trigger your mastery as a direct heal. But also notice that the bloom isn't that powerful, and it's been stated by Gross Carl himself that mushrooms are not supposed to be rotationally used in your cooldown as an AoE rotation, but rather when you have the time to place them in a lull of damage and then trigger for extra burst when needed. Also, check out what's going on here with our life bloom and our mastery. If you've noticed, the mastery triggered instead of a 10-second duration is now 20, and this life bloom is now a 15-second duration, up from 10. This makes it much easier to weave these 2 refreshes into your rotation without stopping what you're doing and being forced into a direct heal. I know there's some PvP concerns with the 15-second duration life bloom, so you can always glyph for it to go back to a 10-second, and it increases the bloom portion, which means it's a throughput gain to let it fall off of your tank. Speaking of keeping bloom on the tanks, check out this new glyph. Remember how target swapping really sucked in all of Cata? Well, now it's really easy because all you have to do is just refresh your life bloom on the new tank and it transfers all of your old stacks over to the new tank. Your Nourish remains your cheap heal, but also note that it still only does extra healing if there's a hot on the target, so if you miss the Nature's Bounty talent, you can still glyph for it, like I'm showing here, if your wild growth didn't happen to land on the target you're nourishing. Also note that we have a viable flash heal now. Regrowth can be glyphed, and if you noticed in the tooltip for regrowth, it does have an increased critical strike chance, but you can guarantee it to be 100% critical strike with this glyph. However, there is a drawback. It removes the hot portion of that spell, which means it can't be swift mendable. But also remember that now druids get Living Seed as a baseline, so you can on demand put on that hot, should you choose. So the addition of our new tools still keep Resto Druids as the #1 spot for the most mobile healer, as you can see I'm demonstrating with my shrooms. There's also a few more tools in our toolkit from our talents, which are also instant cast, that you can add to your additional arsenal of heals. There's some interesting decisions to be made in the level 60 tier for Resto. The Soul of the Forest, for one, on the very far left, does give an increased 50% haste. Well, keep this in mind when it stacks multiplicatively, so mind your new haste caps for your powerful spells that have cooldowns that can benefit from the haste modifier. Also, if you missed the old Tree of Life, you can still get it through this Incarnation talent. It does the exact same thing that it did in Cata. And also, if you're concerned about shifting out of that Tree of Life form and it'll put you in your default form, it actually puts you back in your default treant stance if you're minor glyph for it, so you can stay in permatree form. And with the introduction of Force of Nature, which isn't just balance only, you get these little trees that do some automatic healing, and they're on a really short cooldown too, so if you need the shorter 1-minute cooldown instead of the very long 3-minute cooldown, you can spec to get these little guys. They're also useful because they do this automatic healing without you having to press any additional buttons, which frees up your spells for some more additional global cooldowns you can spend. They're also pets, so they benefit from int modifiers when they're summoned. And then another new addition is this Dream of Cenarius. Dream of Cenarius can make your already new proactive toolkit even more proactive if you have the time to squeeze in a Wrath for a big super heal. If you don't like doing DPS while healing, this new Nature's Vigil is your new throughput cooldown. Or, if you just don't want to think at all, you can put the passive cooldowns into Heart of the Wild. However, keep in mind that Heart of the Wild now is really extra useful for fulfilling roles that you're not specialized into because you now have talents and passives that support this. There's already some really useful times in the game where this would be amazing during an encounter for being able to switch role for something as simple as maybe a tank swap to clear debuffs or to get that extra DPS on a burn phase. Also note that a lot of the passives that you had to spec for are now baseline, like the 15% increase to hit, like you're basically hit capped. We also now have an innate 70% spell pushback resistance, and also your quick rejuves are now at the global cooldown cap without having to talent for it. The new tools, talents, and glyphs have now also given Resto Druids a huge up in PvP that they didn't have before, and the spec overall looks much improved going into the next expansion. Balanced Druids saw lots of changes to their rotation in this expansion. Note that your Solar Beam is now a baseline, so get it out in your bars, and you can now help with interrupts, which means you can interrupt without leaving form. Also note that there are numerous changes that went underway, one of which was they completely took out Insect Swarm, and in its place the Sunfire has been split from Moonfire. This is good for several reasons, because that means you can now line up the appropriate dot when you do jump into a particular eclipse state, and it also means that when you have to move and you're spamming either Moonfire or Sunfire, you can spam the one that is weaker, that wasn't just in an eclipse state, and you don't lose so much damage because the dot from the eclipse is still ticking. Your nukes, for the most part, remain in the same place that they were in your rotation, but check out Star Surge. It now does spell storm damage, which is a fancy way of saying that it does both arcane and nature damage depending on which eclipse state you're in. Also notice that its damage has been tuned up a bit from Wrath and Starfire, so it's extra critical that you use it as close to cooldown as possible. Also, remember that Hurricane spell that you never used? Well, it's been tweaked. It's now a part of your AoE rotation again, so put Hurricane back on your bars. As always, Starfall still gains damage when you're in the proper eclipse state, and so do Shrooms. Something that's been changed for Starfall that I noticed is that now it resets every time you do enter your lunar eclipse state, so it's pretty much like every time you enter a lunar eclipse state, fire and forget it. Remember how frustrating it was to be in that wrong eclipse state right as something really critical was happening in your raid? Well, don't worry. Eclipse has now been changed back to its original form where you can control exactly which state you're moving to depending on which nuke you use. This means that novice players will probably mess up a lot and try to go towards the wrong eclipse state and lose a lot of DPS. However, experienced players now know that this is a huge buff to your DPS because you now have full control over which eclipse state you're moving to. But it's even easier to control which eclipse state you're moving to with this new button. Astral Communion is a complete stop in DPS, however, it channels for 4 seconds your lunar or solar energy and puts you exactly towards the new eclipse state that you want to be in. Note that this is now on the 4-piece Moonkin PvP set bonus as a cast while moving spell, so you can control exactly which eclipse state you want to be in at all times with this button. It also means that when you start fights, you can be in the proper eclipse state for the pull. All in all, the new skill cap with this button is to know when to use it. Sometimes it's better to just keep doing your DPS, and it's been theory crafted that just doing your normal rotation is a DPS gain over stopping when you exit an eclipse state. Or sometimes, if there's a lull or stop in damage for a fight, depending on the encounter mechanics, you can click this and properly set up your burst for the next eclipse phase. Also notice that when you're in a lunar eclipse state, your Hurricane spell changes to a new spell called Astral Storm. Astral Storm makes it possible now to do the same DPS regardless of whether you're in your lunar or solar eclipse state, which means you have full control over choosing whether you want to start your burst AoE rotation with your mushrooms or starting it with a Starfall. Also note that that spell switches right back to Hurricane as soon as you go back to your solar eclipse state. Balance has proper spell pushback resistance from just specking, and also still converts the spirit to hit ratio like it did in Cata. A nice quality of life change was that when you trigger an eclipse state, you basically get so much mana that there's no way you could possibly yourself, so no more stupid mana mechanics. You can also glyph to heal in Moonkin form. And that also means your innervates are now useful on other raid members. Also, you have this new Euphoria talent, passive, which increases the amount of energy you get per nuke when you're not in an eclipse state, which means your eclipses are now vibrating back and forth really fast. Because also, if you've noticed, you get Nature's Grace now as soon as you proc an eclipse state instead of when you cast a dot. So the whole rotation feels a lot more fluid. Also, you'll notice that there's this new crit modifier thing attached to all of our spells, which means the value of crit is now the top priority, even over haste for your secondary stats. Because Star Surge is now so powerful, you want this Shooting Stars buff to proc as often as possible, so you need those dots to be critting. And you also want your nukes to be critting. This is because when one of your nukes crits, depending on which nuke it was and which spell damage it does, it will extend the duration of one of your two dots. This is particularly important for keeping your dots up from the previous eclipse state, which will maximize your DPS. So the more nukes you can get out, the more you can prolong that extra mastery that you had on that dot at the time it was cast. This means our rotation just got a whole lot more complicated, because it means you have to react to these critical strikes that you get from your nukes. In order to maximize your DPS uptime, you need to make interesting decisions, like, should I wait for this dot to fall off and recast it? And that would be yes if it was up from a previous eclipse state, because it has the extra damage. Or do I want to recast it and clip the dot timer right at the end, right before the last tick, which is something that you've been practicing in the current Cata content. And it also means that your Star Surges are really, really important to crit, because a Star Surge will actually it'll refresh the duration of both dots instead of just one of the dots. Which means it's now extra important to proc your shooting stars as soon as you get it. And if that wasn't confusing enough for your dot refreshes, now thanks to the extra energy you get when you're not in an eclipse state, sometimes it's actually a theoretical DPS gain to not refresh your dots at all if they fall off, because you're so close to the next eclipse state. The value of when to cast this depends on how much haste you have and how much mastery you have. Mind you, your damage and your haste are in a constant state of flux, because every time you do proc a new eclipse state, your nature's grace starts automatically, which depending on your haste may yield additional ticks on your dots. And if your head isn't hurting enough yet, now it's time to check out our new DPS boosting cooldown. It's called Celestial Alignment. This is a really weird one because it sets your eclipse state to 0 theoretically in your lunar or solar bar for energy gains, but it treats your character like you're in both eclipse states at the same time. This means that it's a lot of really quick reacting to whether your dots just refresh themselves or not, depending on which nuke you're using. You want to start with your Starfire nuke, because the Starfire, since it's a longer cast time, will get more increased damage, scaling by haste. But if your dots are just refreshed on it, you want to switch to Wrath, because you want to try to proc your Sunfire to refresh again. Thankfully, if your dots do fall off, you can just cast Moonfire and it'll put up both automatically, so you don't have to click both. However, you don't want to do this, because when you do proc this new state, Nature's Grace flies up because you just entered an eclipse state technically, and also your Starfall cooldown resets. This means that this is also something you can use for maxed burst potential with a combination of Starfall and your shrooms. Don't forget that you also have new talents in your talent tree for burst as well that you can line up with this, which makes it behave very interestingly. The new spell we learned at 87 is called Symbiosis, and there is a ton of stuff and information out there that you can look up. I'm not going to explain here. Basically, you give someone an ability, and they in return give you an ability. Depending on who you place it on, it's kind of a buff like Dark Intent. This allows for all kinds of new and interesting PvE and PvP combinations with other classes. It cannot be cast on other druids. If you like this video or others on my site, you can support me by liking, favoriting, commenting, or subscribing to me. I really do appreciate it. Thanks.